The war was on. Tonka with their GoBots, Hasbro with their The Transformers. This wasn't like other competitions. There was only going to realistically be room for one transforming toy on shelves, and both sides were going to push hard. It was as much a battle for media attention and cultural penetration as it was for shelf space. But let's get this out of the way right now. GoBots have a negative reputation. They are Transformers for poor kids. They are the cheap knockoffs. Well, let's be clear about one thing. The GoBots were actually a lot more durable than their adversaries because Popey used a lot more metal in their construction. Yet the GoBots would gain a reputation for cheapness. Why? I believe there are two reasons for that. One was the names. While some later Transformers names would be a little too simplistic or just outright stupid. And I'm not even including the Decepticon sub-team Breast Force, which, unless it transformed into a huge pair of knockers, it's the most disappointing toy you could ever offer to a 12-year-old boy. But the first wave names of the Transformers were devised by the creative forces at Marvel, and they had pizzazz to them, while a lot of the GoBots had names no doubt conceived by the marketing department and sounded like something that a small child would come up with. A car called Turbo, a leader named Leader 1, and other names like Jeeper Creeper, Pow Wow, and Dive Dive. Names that could never be said by anybody seriously. Dive Dive. Even the worst Transformers names would be at least equal to the best GoBot names. And that means something. Second, Takara tended to cheat on the transformations. Popey didn't. But that meant that Takara's tended to look more like humanoid robots. Takara often had extra bits added to it. Hands, for instance, would have to be stuck on after the transformation. The Constructicons could not form Devastator without it. One piece was needed just to attach the legs to the body. But if you ignored the cheating, the end result overall looked good. The same couldn't be said for a lot of the GoBots, who would wind up with disproportionate fat bodies and tiny stick limbs and heads. And that was a good case. Many looked impractical or ridiculous. My personal favorite is the aforementioned Jeeper Creeper, who changes into a Jeep. Get the name? It's actually spelled with a G, though, like he's an uptight high school girl who thinks changing the spelling of her name will make her popular. Anyway, Jeeper Creeper walks around with a wheel halfway hanging off the top of his head, making him look like a robot that knows that hats exist, but not what they are or how they work. What's even worse is that the wheel is in fact the Jeep's spare tire. Please think about that. It's so useless. He's an open vehicle with no driver. A missing spare tire is not going to be the thing that breaks his cover. But no, he has a stupid spare tire awkwardly placed on his head, despite the fact that if he were ever to get a flat tire, he could transform into a robot and fly to his destination. It's like Superman always going into battle with a set of crutches strapped to his back. He will never need them, and even if he somehow did, he still wouldn't need them. But even that can't compare to the appropriately named Wrong Way, a helicopter whose robot mode puts the rotor on his chest rather than on his back, and it doesn't collapse or anything, meaning that he goes through life with this thing in the way all the time. And that was the problem with so many GoBots. So many of their robot forms failed to look like a warrior having badass adventures so much as a torturous existence to be blamed on an uncaring god. I believe that these two things were what contributed to the GoBots' negative reputation. To the target customer, they were often seen as stupid-looking toys with stupid-sounding names. However, there were two positives. The aforementioned durability, and that for the most part, GoBots were inexpensive. I know that's another word for cheap, but it is important. While a handful of Transformers were small, such as Bumblebee or the cassettes, the majority of GoBots were that size, except with more advanced transformation than their mini Transformer counterparts in many cases. There were Super GoBots that were of comparable size to the more standard Transformers, but overall, GoBots tended to be small and inexpensive, and Transformers large and pricey. That's going to make a difference in many instances. If Grandma's buying for 12 children for Christmas, buying the boys GoBots instead of Transformers would be the better option. And would she know the difference? Or if your kid is going to a birthday party or exchanging gifts with a classmate, you're not going to drop $30 or $40, adjusted for inflation, for a Transformer when you could get a GoBot for half that price. Of course, your business plan can hardly depend on confusion and apathy, but it likely helped contribute to GoBots' surprising longevity given the negative reputation that they possess. And it wasn't as if Tonka was holding back. They got GoBots to market 5 months sooner than Hasbro. They put together their GoBots animated series and got it on air first, too. Both seemed like serious advantages. But this was a marathon, not a sprint, and the experience that Hasbro, Marvel, and Griffin Bacall had with G.I. Joe allowed them to skip the learning phase. They showed up second, sure, but that was only because their moves had been carefully planned. An advertising campaign, a comic book tie-in, and an animated series.
It is a world transformed, where things are not what they seem. It is the world of the Transformers.
The Transformers, more than meets the eye. Autobots wage their battle to destroy the evil forces of the Decepticons. The Transformers, robots in disguise. The Transformers, more than meets the eye.
The Transformers from Marvel Comics.
And don't discount the comic book. This was when comics were still available at the 7-Eleven in your local grocery store, another outlet to maintain and expand brand awareness. GoBots were brought to the small screen by Hanna-Barbera, obviously a big name in television animation. But banking on them to establish the GoBots brand wasn't as great as it sounds. By 1970, Hanna-Barbera was dominating television animation, controlling 80% of the children's television market. But they made a mistake. Hanna-Barbera dominated through sheer relentless saturation of the airwaves. That's what caused them to grow to be such a force. But they created such a demand and were so determined to meet it that their expert animators were supplemented by the inexperienced. And oh, did it show. The company was making even more money, but the cartoons themselves were clearly being made more and more cheaply. Their decline was becoming obvious as repackaged vintage cartoons like Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies, animations that still looked as high quality and smooth as it had decades earlier, only emphasized how inferior Hanna-Barbera's stuff looked. Not to mention needing to churn out scripts for the cartoons at a rate that sucked the quality out of them as well. And during the late 70s and early 80s, Japanimation, as anime was called here at the time, came to America and dazzled audiences. Amidst all of that and new arrivals looking to make a name for themselves in animation, Hanna-Barbera was quickly seen as a has-been clearinghouse for hacks. So you can see why, in retrospect, Hanna-Barbera was such a horrible choice for Tonka to make. If your product is synonymous with cheapness, having Hanna-Barbera animated is like trying to prove you're sophisticated by wrestling a greased pig. That's not to say the series challenge of the GoBots was irredeemable, though. It not only included Frank Welker and Peter Cullen, who were major voices for the Transformers and well-known voice actors. Welker actually voiced the robot Herbie in that Fantastic Four show I mentioned last time. But it also included names like Phil Hartman, Brock Peters, and Rene Auberjonois. The show included both female and male GoBots. GoBots were actually cyborgs, which of course meant their slogan, "Mighty Robots, Mighty Vehicles," was wrong. Also because some of them weren't vehicles. Or mighty when you got down to it. But yes, they represented both genders. And while one could say that the Transformers were robots, so gender didn't matter, their use of masculine pronouns nevertheless suggested otherwise, until they were admitted to exist but rarely given a toy. Hasbro said that female action figures sold less, which was why this was limited. For instance, the Baroness was completely Lara Hama's creation to offer some shake-up of the Cobra dynamic. Kind of ironic that if it wasn't for Barbie, G.I. Joe might never have existed. And it wasn't as if the Transformers didn't have their own screw-ups, from the infamous Bot episode that brought back some of the recently neglected First Wave characters, only to humiliate them before they all died, to the episode Thief in the Night, which was so offensive that Casey Kasem quit the show. The unintended sick jokes on display, like showing us the horrifying corpse of Windcharger, only to have him later show up running by in the background. Or the Decepticons cheering the plan to rescue Galvatron, and the crowd includes Galvatron himself. "Can I help rescue me too? I'm worried sick about me." Nor was this a quick clash and then over thing. GoBots went the distance. Their animated series lasted for more than 60 episodes, and even had their own film just a short while before the Transformers the movie hit screens. But while the former brought in Roddy McDowall, Telly Savalas, and Margot Kidder, The latter included Judd Nelson, Leonard Nimoy, Eric Idle, Robert Stack, and Orson Welles. The Transformers film made more its opening weekend than GoBots, War of the Rocklords did in its entire theatrical run, despite the latter appearing on more screens than the former. Still, if GoBots endured that long, why is it that they're the ones in the ash bin of history? Is it that cheapness perspective? Perhaps. But I think it boils down to the word I keep mentioning: branding. The Transformers had an overall consistent worldwide appearance to them, an appearance that in many cases didn't resemble the actual toy. Ratchet, for instance, bore almost no similarity to the toy, but given the same look, and not just here, but around the world. Takara quickly got on board with Hasbro to market the Transformers into a worldwide phenomenon. Bandai, on the other hand, was doing its own thing with Machine Robo, while Tonka was doing GoBots, hence there was no unified branding on them. Also, rather than the stylized if inaccurate approach of the Transformers, GoBots made them always look like their toys. Now that does sound like the way it should be done, otherwise it sounds misleading. Except, nobody really cared that Ratchet didn't look like he was supposed to in the cartoon and comics and everywhere else. On the toy package, that was how he looked. You knew what you were getting, and you didn't really mind, 'cause it was Ratchet. I know branding, that word, might rub you the wrong way, 'cause it's a business term. It sounds so cynical, as much as saying that the series existed just to push toys. Which it did. Pointing to whole episodes of the cartoon or issues of the comic that focused on a new toy to help push sales of it, that's an example in many minds of the cynical marketing going on. And yet, I think it should be noted how it pushed the toy sales in this form. It did so by not only making us aware of the toy, but of the toy's character. The comic, the cartoon, the toy packaging with its tech specs, all of that. They told the same backstory for the most part about this character. The same thing that helped make them come alive. That, after all, was why kids left the theater in tears after the movie killed off so many of the original robots. These were characters that they had come to love, and they'd watched them die. The inclusion of Marvel and Bob Budiansky in particular was the edge that Hasbro needed over Tonka. By working to give the toy line a mythology, by working to give the toys identities, it was more than just good guys versus bad guys. If you've read the Transformers series Bible, there is a sense there of excitement on the part of the developers for the story opportunities that this provided. Indeed, the mythology was so intriguing, there's a subtle lamentation that so much of the show would by necessity have to be set on Earth. The difference between the GoBots and the Transformers was, Challenge of the GoBots felt like a show about a toy. Transformers felt like a show that had its own toy. Dan Gilvezan, who voiced Bumblebee, and also Peter Parker in the previously mentioned Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, originally thought that this was a role for a half-hour toy commercial. But he says after studying all the material he received for the audition, his opinion changed drastically. This was a genuine creative effort and not shamelessly shilling plastic to kids. It was no doubt why Season 3 of the Transformers would often receive so much venom from fans. It was the point when it being a toy had elbowed aside what they had loved in order to justify focusing on the new toys exclusively. The story and character that had been at the heart had bent for the sake of sales that, ultimately, it was all about. Now, certainly the very name Transformers suggests change, and while there was an overall status quo to be maintained, a lot of changes happen within the bounds of that status quo. The further evolution of the story is logical, sure, and yet it lacked respect for what had come before by the way that this transpired. I'm going out on a limb here, but I think that's why for many Transformers was a fad. The very thing that made the Transformers a success was the reason fans ultimately moved on from it. These were characters that they loved. With them gone, the magic was gone. This waning interest led to the end of the animated series in America with a 3-part episode for its 4th season, and the comic book eventually as well, although it boasted of its success with number 80 in a 4-issue limited series on the cover. After a 2-year hiatus in America, a new line came out, Generation 2, a reboot of sorts. and usually associated with a few bad decisions like the rap music commercials and the decision to just repackage the original animated series with Cybernet's Space Cube. It's true that the majority of the figures in this line were just redecos, same toy but in a different color scheme, and they were competing with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles at the height of their popularity. But I believe that point that allowed them to triumph over GoBots in the first place, the connection to character, was what was lacking in G2 and the reason for its failure. And whatever did happen to the competition? Kenner was bought out by Tonka in 1987, which in turn was bought by Hasbro in 1991. Technically, that means that Hasbro owns the GoBots, although it's really just an IP. The toys themselves are naturally owned by Bandai, and the cartoon belongs to Warner Brothers, Hanna-Barbera having been bought out itself in 1991. The same thing happened to the Transformers cartoon, actually. When Sunbow's assets were bought up by Sony Wonder, it included their cartoons of the Transformers and G.I. Joe, who sold them to TV Loonland, who eventually sold them to Hasbro. But the acquisition of Kenner would help revitalize the Transformers. They were given control of the line and the responsibility of bringing them back. The suggestion of organic-like machines eventually led to the reinvention of them all with Beast Wars. While naturally that was a divisive change, Beast Wars was eventually vindicated, largely due to a feeling that the era offered a creative resurgence, especially surrounding the CGI animated series. It was the polar opposite of G2. It didn't try to reintroduce the old favorites. It worked to create new favorites, characters that the audience could once again connect with. That's why everything in its history was so vital to its success. The Transformers depended on the hard-learned lessons of G.I. Joe and the creative input of multiple partners to help move toy-line spin-offs into a global pop culture phenomenon. The franchise continued into the 21st century with several lines that tried to retain that part of it, to varying degrees of success. Even if the characters were reimagined for new eras, as long as that creative core remained, the Transformers endured, so that soon, the kids that had bought those first toys in 1984 were now adults buying and sharing it with their own children. A lot of people and groups were involved along the way. Some things went right, some went very wrong. But regardless, the passion for the Transformers, thanks to that creative core, shows that a lot more right than wrong was there. And I hope that this look has shown that there was a lot more to this story than meets the eye.